Hi, welcome to More Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by Brian Godawa. He's a professional writer and a filmmaker for over 20 years with a passion both for the intellect and imagination, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. He's an artisan of word, of image and story, engages the mind, the heart, and the soul. He's also an author and international speaker on art, movies, worldviews, and his faith. And his book, Hollywood Worldviews, Watching Films with Wisdom and Discernment, is used as a textbook then in schools around the US and even further afield nowadays. And his articles and movies and philosophy have been published around the world also. And Brian's unique Chronicles series of novels incarnate in some ways his worldview and his theology and rich narrative. And Brian's also an award-winning screenwriter who's worked in Hollywood. His feature film was To End All Wars, starring Kiefer Sutherland. And his skills and expertise have expanded beyond that to include writing and directing feature films, documentaries, and video promos. So I suppose, first of all, Brian, can you tell us a little bit about your journey to Christ, number one, and how that developed? And then I suppose when your love for film began and when did those two converge for you?
Hmm. Yeah, that's quite a journey. So I have always been an artist. I was a visual artist when I was younger. I still am, but that was my original vision for life. I wanted to be an illustrator, someone who would illustrate or paint or something like that. And so when I was in high school, I had always been sensitive to the meaning of life, purpose of life, wanting to find meaning and purpose, even as a young 17-year-old. And as I looked around me, and I wasn't a Christian at the time, but as I looked around me, I guess I'd have to say that death became something that was the great equalizer in terms of great men and poor men alike. It equalizes everything, and no matter what you do, no matter what you achieve in this world, you're going to be dead and gone, just like everybody else. And I remember a fellow artist had actually committed suicide at that time, a fellow student. And though I've never dealt with suicidal ideation at all, but nevertheless, the reality, it brought home that reality that, wow, some people don't have meaning, or some people, or we're all going to die, and I'm going to die. It made that death become real to me. And it made me think more about, well, what do I want out of life, and what's going to give me meaning and purpose? And I had thought that actually, uh, being a great artist might give some meaning and purpose, some significance. And I had always loved Michelangelo Buonarroti, the famous Renaissance artist, Sistine Chapel, the David, and all that. And so when I was young, I thought, wow, we're still studying his works, and he's dead and gone. And so I thought I wanted to be like Michelangelo. He's my hero. But the reality of death soon brought home to me that, well, wait a minute now. When you're dead and gone, if you look at the timeline of the universe, my little existence isn't even a pinpoint on that huge timeline. I'm here and gone, right? And so what's the point, And then secondly so let's say I was Michelangelo. When I was dead, I didn't know where I would be, but I certainly could assume that it had no connection with this world. So what good would it do me if people were, studying my works of art, long after I was dead? But not only that, but in the end, everyone's forgotten. There's a famous Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is my favorite Bible book. And, it talks about how, the rich man and the poor die alike. And, all of life is wind and vanity, because the great man stores up wealth and riches and achievements, but he dies, and all of it is taken over by a fool, and that's really like the reality of life. And so it really made me think of, wow, there's that real lack of real meaning and purpose. And even that great achievements or great art really doesn't ultimately do it. It falls short. And that was around that time that I was introduced to a Christian, it was kind of a Christian ministry that had a lot of arts in it. And I think that's why I was drawn to it. And they, it was for teens, and they had rock music, and they did skits, and then they had games, like sport games and stuff for teens. And then you'd sit and listen to a little sermon, but it was very relevant to life. It made the gospel of Jesus Christ break out of its religious confines that I had. And and showed me the, because I'd been exposed to it. I basically knew, I had a somewhat religious family upbringing, but it wasn't a personal reality, I think, for any of us. And so I came to realize, oh, this feeling, this lack of purpose that I have, this sense of distance, the distance of God or the silence of God, like you look around, you think, if God's real, then how come he seems so silent or so distant,
Mhm.
And I soon came to realize that distance is a separation caused by my sin, caused by my own violation of God's holy commands, And we can summarize those in the 10 Commandments, right? Stealing, lying, cheating, whatever, all that stuff. And even murdering in your heart. You don't even have to murder someone to murder them in your heart. And before God's perfect holiness, that separates you. And that's what brings that emptiness and the despair that I had actually experienced. And so I just realized, I came to the realization that, this is why Jesus died on the cross, because that sin that separated me, Jesus took that sin upon himself and experienced separation from God and atoned for my sin that brought me back into the ability to have that relationship with the perfect holy God. I was forgiven of my sins. And it was an understanding that I was not a bad person, by world standards. I didn't take drugs. I didn't even have premarital sex, right? So, I mean, I was just a good kid. But what I realized was that goodness is a relative term, and I was actually deeply depraved before the holy God, my holy creator. And so it was a lie to think that I was a good person. And so that recognition of my need for him and need for forgiveness. And I committed myself to become a disciple of Jesus Christ. And that began in high school. And interestingly enough, after that, when I got discipled by another Christian, that was when I really started to grow in Christ. And that's when I began to realize that I now had that eternal meaning and purpose that I was longing for, something that transcended this life, because this life is so short, right? 90 years if you're lucky. Nothing, blink of an eye, right? But that being connected to that transcendent creator launches that understanding into eternity and gives you real true meaning and purpose. And now I had a message or a meaning to communicate through my art, rather than just sort of looking around and drawing from my own humanity, which, you can get some pretty good works of art that way. But now I had a higher purpose that raise that level of meaning in my art, to give it purpose and meaning. And but it was interesting because I struggled, because at that time there was a dichotomy almost between my faith and my art. Didn't quite understand how it all worked together. And especially in those days, I think, the church has gotten better in general. The church meaning, the broadest generalization of believers in Christ. And it it still struggled with appreciating and understanding art, because art pushes the boundaries. It's it art is something that makes you think deeper, and a lot of people just want straight pan answers and such. So I was having a hard time. And in the church also, the church had a history of not the greatest relationship with the arts, if you know what I mean. But I discovered the author, Francis Schaeffer. So he's way back in the 70s, and he was a Christian who was one of the first sort of theologians who really loved the arts. And he wrote a lot about the arts and philosophy. So he would write about the history of philosophy and how it was integrated with the arts and how they communicated. And one of his main theories, which I adopted as my own, was understanding that the power of culture is in worldview and worldview thinking. And so the ability to change culture comes from the ability to, uh, uh, shall we say, the transformation of culture begins with the academic world, the ivory tower, the philosophers. Right? They talk about all these highfalutin things and they struggle with them, and a lot of the average people don't really understand it. but they're in the academia, and then the academia has students that come and they teach those students, and students grow up and go out into the world. And so you see that philosophy of a culture trickles down sort of from academia into culture and the arts, and also into government and your daily life. And that began my first growth in understanding, how do I integrate my Christian faith with my art and through understanding worldview thinking. And that was the beginning of my journey when I was a young artist, many years ago. And like I said, at first I was more of a visual artist, but when I went to college, I had such a burning desire to communicate this gospel of Jesus Christ that I known that I just, I started a drama troupe, and we would go out on the free speech part of campus and do a bunch of skits. And we would make up like Monty Python type skits, funny, humorous ones for college, but they were rooted in like the parables of Jesus, right? Or, rooted in gospel truths. And that was a way in which I sought to communicate. And that was when I began to fall in love with drama and narrative as a means of communicating truth and yeah, just truth and meaning to this world.
Mm.
And that was around the time when of course, I've always loved movies and such, but I began to grow in my vision for storytelling and for the desire to make movies that would honor God. And when the first movie that sort of changed my whole, or gave me the vision for the rest of my life, was Chariots of Fire, which dates me, of course. We're talking, what, 1981 or 1983? But when that movie won the Oscar, and that was a movie that was a good, solid Hollywood movie, but it also had a muscular Christian faith in it in a way that others did not. And it just showed you that you could incorporate Christianity into part of the storyline, and it's a legitimate story. And of course, there'd always been some, Christians have had a bad reputation of making bad art, including bad movies, right? And I think still today they've gotten a lot better, but they still leave a lot to be desired. And but so Chairs of Fire became sort of my vision, and I wanted to go to Hollywood, and I wanted to make movies in Hollywood, but incorporate my Christian worldview into them. And it wasn't until I got married to my wife, who is now of 36 years, the most wonderful woman in the world. But when I got married to her, it was shortly after that I began to script write, write screenplays. But at the time I didn't go to college for it. I actually had to learn on my own. I read a bunch of books, went a bunch of seminars, beat the streets, just did everything on my own. I was self-taught type of thing. And that was when I began my journey of seeking to try to make movies. And, it took a few years, maybe 10 years or more, before I got my first movie made in 2001, which was To End All Wars. And that began my new sort of focus in my life of storytelling more than the visual means, and I was a graphic designer and an illustrator. And so I still have that background, and I still use it. I design my own book covers. I design, and I do a lot of visual art. And it's immensely useful, but it's just not my focus, And so from that point on till the present, my focus has been more on storytelling. And we can get into novels later, but that's the sort of journey up until that point,
Yeah.
the point of movies and storytelling.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Brian. And I think there's something really to be said for Francis Schaeffer when you see the good fruit that has come from him and his work. Before we started recording, I talked about Nancy Piercy. I've interviewed Dr. Oz Guinness, so many. Vishal Mangalwadi is doing someone of
Yeah, Labrie. I love Labrie, man. They're great.
beautiful. And I wonder if you might want to speak a little bit more about him or any other figures who've been especially inspirational or influential for you and that
Yeah,
discipleship process that you talked about.
sure. I hate to be cliche, but it really, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are probably the dominant influence on my storytelling throughout my whole life.
Mhm.
C.S. Lewis also, though, from the side of apologetics and philosophy, he helped me to fall in love with philosophy and apologetics, showing me that Christianity had a very intelligent means of being able to answer, atheism and skepticism and all that. And it's so funny because even to this day, like things that I feel like I discover in my own spiritual life and intellectual life, I've always find out that C.S. Lewis also already been there, and he wrote about it better than I could.
Yeah.
And so I love the guy, and no, I don't agree with every element of his theology, but you don't have to. He was a man of God, and I've learned so much and was inspired by him so much. And although that would be more the apologetics, because I also took on that love of philosophy and apologetics, and even to this day, it has driven a lot of my life. But the other component is the storytelling, and I think Tolkien was a much better storyteller than Lewis. And I think Lewis was a better Christian apologist, but Tolkien was a better storyteller. And of course, The Lord of the Rings was my initiation in high school into that storytelling, but then also understanding how to incorporate Christian faith through mythopoeia, through that understanding of how myth, which is not the negative term that many Christians think it is, meaning it's a falsehood, it's a lie, it's a myth. No, myth or mythic thinking is more about stories that, and this would be more like the technical academic definition, which is stories that embody the worldview and values of a culture or a society. These stories that we tell ourselves, they could be true stories or false stories. Not false, but true fiction or nonfiction stories is what I'm getting to. And so that understanding how to incorporate your faith into your storytelling in a way that's not preachy, not propagandistic. And that, of course, is a lifelong journey. but I think Tolkien was my initial inspiration for that. And I thought about this, and I thought, well, what about my movie writing? And there are a lot of great writers in Hollywood, and certainly in the history of Hollywood. But I find it interesting that I don't really have like a specific writer whose work I have loved and followed and learned from. It's been more individual scripts and individual movies, and then studying or learning from that storytelling in that particular movie. So it's been more specific in that sense. I thought about that. That was kind of interesting. And ironically, as a writer, more of my bigger influence in Hollywood is more from directors, which is kind of interesting. And I'm always trying to fight for recognition for the writers, because people don't realize that the writer had to write that story before it became a great movie. And if it's not on the page, it's not on the stage. So, it really starts with a great story, and the writer's responsible for that. But of course, the director gets involved, and he or she shapes the story as well. And of course, takes it to a higher level. But for me, I would just, I don't know, I would say that there's been several directors whose work has been very inspirational for me. I think Mel Gibson is probably the greatest for me, one of the greatest directors in history. And I know his personal life leaves a lot to be desired, but his artistic work and how he's, his genius, his masterpieces, from, Apocalypto to The Passion of the Christ to Hacksaw Ridge, and not everything he's done was great, but he's done a lot of great movies. And I mean, like, that really stand the test of time. But the way that he embodies faith, and we'll talk about some of these examples, I suppose, but the way he embodies faith and truth is the way, it's sort of like the incarnation of the Tolkien Lewis worldview that I have loved and sought for in my own life. So he's been a pretty significant influence on me.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Brian. And there's so many great books that you have that I could talk about. But today I want to focus primarily on Hollywood Worldviews that I mentioned, watching films with wisdom and discernment, because I think it touches on so many points of interest for people who watch my channel and the little corner of the internet that I circulate in. And I'm sure then it has a much broader appeal also. And I want to ask you about that first then. What, I suppose, inspired that book, and what do you hope that readers will ultimately take away from it then?
Yeah, it's interesting because that book's like 20, 25 years old now. It's funny. And I chose movies in there as examples that I thought would be classics. And many of them still are to this day, I think. So it lasts the test of time, and the book's still selling really well because of that, I think. And I was one of the first ones to write about worldviews and movies, and particularly for Christians, how to watch movies with wisdom and discernment, because I had, as I was developing my own theory of storytelling, which technically is called your aesthetic, which is your philosophy of beauty, right? I had been studying storytelling from the Hollywood story gurus. But when I was doing that, I was realizing, wow, has a lot of Christianity sort of embedded in it, whether people know it or not, And of course, the Christ story, as we now call it, the Christ story, is pretty much the foundation of the most generic hero's journey that we've all heard of, right? From Star Wars and Joseph Campbell till today, the hero's journey, and that's a legitimate dominant story form within the Western civilization, right? Well, things like that, I started realizing, like I was learning that the journey of the hero as they begin with their goal and their objective, and then there's, they are obstructed externally by a villain, or internally by their own inner flaws. And then the complications grow, and it finally gets to the end of the story where the hero cannot achieve their goal, and he thinks he's never going to achieve it. And that's when he has a visit to death, so to speak. Someone usually dies, or he himself dies, or comes close to death. He loses something, and that's when he realizes his personal inner flaw. And then from there, the hero is able to recognize his wrong view of the world and change his behavior. And that external changing of behavior based on a change of heart or a repentance gives him the ability to vanquish the external villain who's after him at the very end. And that sort of paradigm is a paradigm of conversion, and it's very much rooted in Christ imagery. Now, of course, Jesus Christ himself was not a sinner and didn't have flaws, internal flaws, etc. But that main motif, which some people say, oh, that's older than Christianity. Well, yeah, it is. But the God who created the universe is the one who embedded that story within the universe, and that's where we get it from. And so, in terms of historically, Christianity is later on the scene, but the creator God of the Bible is the one who actually embedded that story. And that's why Jesus as Messiah he's the final, as Lewis and Tolkien would say, right? He was the myth that is true. So yeah, the myth was there for long ages because God embedded it into creation, and Jesus is the final incarnation of that come to fruit. So that was I got going down a pathway there, but learning these storytelling structural elements and seeing how they connected and reflected a lot of Christian truth, it just made me want to help Christians to see this stuff and appreciate movies more. Because in the church at the time, I saw the two extremes, which is sort of, I called them the cultural anorexics and the cultural gluttons. And so the cultural gluttons would be the people who just are lazy, or they just don't think, it's just entertainment. I'm just enjoying. What's the big deal? Or the cultural, when they're watching movies and such. But what they're doing is they're consuming ideas and worldviews that are antithetical in many ways, to their own faith, and they don't realize it. But then the other extreme was the cultural anorexics who well, there's sex and violence in movies, so I don't watch anything. They're like ascetics, and they cut it all out because they want to. It's a good desire to be holy and such, but in so doing, they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And in fact, they're misunderstanding to some degree the nature of storytelling itself. Meaning, yes, if there's sex and violence in the story, that doesn't make it bad, because guess what? There's a lot of sex and violence in the Bible. So the point is, why? Why is it there? And what's the meaning and purpose? And, if you are going to exploit sexuality and pornography and have all that stuff in there, yeah, then that makes it bad. But that's not necessarily inherently what all stories are doing. In fact, most Western storytelling, even Hollywood storytelling, is rooted in that paradigm of, you show, just like the Bible, you show that in the beginning, you show the evil, or you show the sin, or you show the flaws, you show the bad stuff that is in the world. And it's by the end of the story that the hero overcomes that. So you have to have an accurate depiction of evil if your redemption that you're offering the world is to have any significance or impact. And that's why the Bible has so much sin, from genocide to mass rape, gang rape and such, because it's showing the true depravity of human nature, so that the redemption of Christ is all that it can be and all should be for people, right? And so trying to communicate that to help Christians realize that sometimes they need to stick with it a little bit longer and realize that the story is not glorifying sin. Sometimes it does, but you have to be able to watch and discern as adults. And that was my goal and motive. And I'm happy to say that nowadays, I don't think the problem is there as much as it was, but I still think we all need to be constantly learning and growing with our discernment faculties anyway, to be able to figure out how is it that they're communicating. Because I can assure you, it's not just me. This is all storytellers in Hollywood. We have a worldview, and we're trying to incorporate it into our story to get you to think our way. That's the way it is, folks, whether you know it or not. And I think it's more obvious. It's more known now than it has been. And when someone becomes very heavy-handed, we call that propaganda or preaching, right? And those are whether it's Avatar, preaching earth worship, right? Or the latest bad Christian movie, it's preaching doesn't, we react inside because it becomes obvious what they're doing. But it's really, so many stories are so much more effective in embodying their worldview within the story, so that you become caught up into it and become affected by it, whether you know it or not. So that was the whole purpose of me writing that book. And it ended up doing so well. Like I said, it's still doing really well. I can't get the rights back from my publisher because it's doing so well, even after all these years. So I'm happy about that. But that was part of me actually working through my own philosophy of storytelling and being able to cement it down, so that as I went forward from there, I would have a stronger consciousness of what I was doing when I was writing my stories.
That's excellent. Thank you, Brian. And I appreciate that distinction, which I think is more biblical rather than this kind of fundamentalist approach. And I think we're in great danger if we confuse those two. And I like that big picture perspective of the Bible. Even online, if I was teaching children, I would use the Bible Project and things like that. So you have verses and context and the context of the story, and it's all centered around Christ's love and everything. And I think that comes across in your work, and I really appreciate that. And you mentioned this redemptive quality, if I might call it that, even with things like sex and violence. And in your work, you show that they can play a role in redemptive storytelling.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit of that, and maybe some examples where this is done well versus where it's done in that kind of more pornographic way that you lamented?
Yeah, I think I became sort of the apologist for R-rated movies, because at the time, now of course there's a lot more that are willing to defend this, but at the time I was, my first chapter in my book was all about sex and violence in the Bible and in the movies, to try to break down the fundamentalist paradigm, or a false paradigm of the nature of sin within art and storytelling and such, and try to return to a more biblical basis. And what I mean by that is I explained the nature of kind of what I alluded to already, which is that when you are communicating redemption, particularly in art, if you do not accurately depict the evil from which you are seeking to redeem people, then it won't ring true to them. So your redemption, your answer that you're trying to offer them, will also not ring true. If you watch a movie, and I've seen this still in some Christian movies, where the villain it looks like something out of the 1970s American television, where it's just like, come on, cheesy, and you're not scared, you're just really not scared by them. Then you don't get a sense of the evil that needs, and then the redemption, it becomes very, very shallow and very without much impact, right? And but the problem is in order to depict that evil, then you have to go down some dark pathway in your art, in your stories, like the Bible does. So what I did in there was I actually drew out a lot of examples in the Bible where sometimes the evil is not explicit, but sometimes it is explicit. And in fact, sometimes even sexuality, that's good sexuality, is explicit in the Bible, like the Song of Solomon. As a matter of fact, the English translation I pointed out in there, the English translation is not true to the Hebrew because the translators were too prudish. And so they sort of covered it over. You read it in the original Hebrew, it can be quite explicit at times, right? And that's married love, of course, but still it's sexuality, and in a way that modern people, Christians might not like. But does this mean, therefore pornography is okay? It's like, no, that's not the point I'm making. But what I was trying to say is that sometimes this harsh depiction of sins can be, if done well, and if it's done well, it's appropriate. But it's a gray area. It's not black and white, and so we might have some disagreements as adults, but we need to begin to understand it. So some examples might be, even in more recent times. And I'm trying to pick ones that also, like, I would think have a strong Christian worldview behind them, just to make the point. And well, of course, my original movie, To End All Wars, I depicted the true life suffering of prisoners of war, Allied prisoners of war under the Japanese in World War II in some prison camps, and it was very brutal. And what's ironic is, and there's very harsh language in there because that's what the reality was. And it's funny because we could not, in the movie, there's a lot of F words and stuff, and the violence is brutal, and we didn't even show a tenth of the violence they actually experienced. We were holding back, and even then we couldn't get anything less than R-rated. And Christian distributors wouldn't take it. And so, we were independently distributed because of that. And yet to this day, I still hear people saying it's Christians telling me it's my favorite movie of all time. It's still doing really well as a movie, just out there. It's on Amazon Prime, by the way, for anyone who wants to watch it. But that was an example of the violence and harsh language. I think a more recent example of harsh language would be Father Stew. So that was a great movie made by Mark Wahlberg's in it. I think Stu is another true story that with Mark Wahlberg plays a guy who was out on the streets, a very harsh criminal guy who ends up becoming a Catholic priest. And he has very harsh language, and he gets redeemed, and he becomes a very influential priest, but he still has a harsh edge to him. And that's the reality. And look, does that justify, therefore, cussing is okay as a Christian? No. But when you realize people aren't perfect, and it takes time for things to the rough edges to be, taken off. And in some ways that transformation in his life as a rough guy who becomes a priest, he can relate to rough people in a way that others can't. But the point is that there's some bad language in there, but it's a very redemptive film about about suffering and how to trust in God for suffering. It's just truly deep and profound. And I think actually Mel Gibson started it, but I don't think he made it. But he didn't. He was a secondary character. So, and there are other movies like that. Machine Gun Preacher is another one of my personal favorites. Another true story. And again, this criminal guy, literally, and he was a bad criminal dude, played by Gerard Butler. He gets dramatically saved after he gets out of prison, and he gets dramatically saved and baptized, and he finds out about these kids over in, I think it's Nigeria, over in Africa, who are just children, and Christians are being oppressed by these Muslim terrorists. So he just gets a burden to go over and protect these kids and build schools and build villages for them. And in the meantime, he uses a machine gun to protect them against all these Muslims with AK-47s trying to kill children, right? And it's just a powerful story. But he also goes through his own journey of the violence he's a violent man, but he's protecting people's lives, which is biblically self-defense. But it still affects you. Reality is not sharp and clean, black and white, perfect. It's messy. Reality's messy. But the point is it shows powerful redemption in that violent context, and there's some harsh language as well. And these are movies that I would argue are very biblical and very Christian, you know. But
Hmm.
then think of Sound of Freedom, this new movie with Jim Caviezel this last year. It's all about sex trafficking.
Hmm.
Now, here's a good example where, you find a balance. They don't show sexuality with children because that borders on child pornography, right? And so they have to come up with creative ways of implying, like they show him, his eyes supposedly watching the screen of child porn when he has to find out what is this guy doing. He turns on the computer and he sees what's on there. And we just see his eyes watching it, and it's just deeply moving. So there are ways that you can not exploit, but still have the evil and have the sin in there. And that's a good example of a story that does so, but it still captures the emotional power really well.
Hmm.
So, I could go on and on, but those are just some, I think, some fine examples of what we're talking about.
No, that's excellent. Thank you, Brian. And I think one movie that comes to my mind similar is A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick. The way he focuses on the evil of the Nazis and so on, but it's not the traditional war movie. So much of it is hidden from view, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think shit, one of the most powerful anti-war movies, and
Yeah.
more than that, anti kind of cultish
Yeah.
territory
Yeah.
for sure.
Along those lines too, classic example I always used to use is Schindler's List, right? So here
Mm,
you have a movie, probably the greatest movie about the Holocaust in my mind ever made, and it's truly about showing evil and powerful redemption, etc. And I remember, there's a case where there's they show the Jews being stripped of all their clothes and just run around like a herd of animals naked, and it's humiliating, and they show that. And that is a case where I would argue that was appropriate because it's not done to titillate, it's not sexual. It's showing the depth of humiliation and evil that the Nazis did even to their psyche, their consciousness, right? But yet at the same time, there's like, and literally, I was on this program talking, and this woman calls in and she says, "Yeah, well, I was watching that, and there was that scene where Schindler's List, Schindler gets out of bed because he was committing adultery with some woman, and they show her breasts for 1 or 2 seconds, and I'm like, and so she hated the movie, and I'm like, well, I'm not going to defend that 2 seconds, all right, because I don't think it's appropriate, and they could have done easily without it, right? But are you going to argue and therefore say because it's not perfect and there's 2 seconds of that, then all the goodness and just biblical morality of that movie should be thrown out because an imperfect, director, makes an error like that or does a mistake like that, it's ludicrous to me. Look, you can close your eyes, you can turn away, you can even mention I didn't like that part of the movie, and that's fine, and we should do that for sure. But you don't throw out that whole movie because of that one flaw. Now, and I talk a little bit about this in the book as well, where that leads us to, where do you draw the line? And that again is another gray area that you have to decide for yourselves as adults. And then we also have to listen to each other and make our arguments for, what we think is acceptable and what isn't. And for instance, if like I wouldn't defend pornography in movies. But if you have a weakness for pornography and a movie's more sexual, and it doesn't even have to show much, but it could just be very sexual and it tempts you too much, then no, you shouldn't watch that, but just having sexuality doesn't make it wrong. It's a matter of you personally, and then how much do they show and deal with it, et cetera. And so or or the language, right? Like I would say that, yeah, sometimes some movies go so far. Like I would argue Quentin Tarantino is a good example in general of just um completely excessive F words, and like it makes it look stupid to me, And yet there are some movies that have it, like my own movie, or, I remember Goodfellas, which is a classic movie about, the mafia, and they had a lot of F-bombs in that movie, but that movie, it was appropriate because that's how those people really were. And now Tarantino's just making movies that he just loves to bask in that excessive, violence and excessive language. And I would argue, and people might disagree with me, but I would argue, yeah, then that's going too far. And a lot of times I just turn it off because it's too much. And it's not, these are things we have to step through and argue, right? So it's not wrong to deal with rape, with adultery, with murder, or even torture, because the Bible has that, right? But how much are they showing? And at what point are you going to say, okay, this is too much, I need to back out, because they have what's called torture porn, right? Where, it's like horror movies that are intended to show the most grotesque ways you can kill a person or torture them, actually. And that's not acceptable. But yet torture in movies is almost part of the paradigm of the hero's journey. One of my favorite movies, which we'll be talking more about, is Braveheart, right? And he was tortured at the very end, but they didn't show it all. And the point was a bigger transcendent point, rather than, well, let's just get our kicks off of seeing how gross we can be. You know what I mean? So torture itself can be legitimate if it's done appropriately, and it can be taken too far, like some of these, horror movies now can be. So those are just, I think, some examples and of how and why it's a gray issue, and we've got to be in conversation about it. But we have to understand that just having sin in there of the worst kind does not make it wrong. It's a matter of how you deal with it and what is the context. And sadly, we don't always know what the ending of the movie is, but you can tell. You can check movie reviews and find out, what's the point of the movie, to see, is it going to be redemptive or not. But honestly, I would say most mainstream movies are at least attempts at being redemptive. Sure, there's a lot of humanistic and bad morality. Obviously, I would make a strong argument for that, but not always. And again, movies are mixtures, because you can even have something that, like I said, like the Schindler's List, where it's like, okay, I won't defend that, and it's not good, I don't like it. But at what point does the good outweigh, or the bad outweigh the good? And that's where we have to debate and make those decisions for our own consciences as well.
That's excellent. Thank you, Brian. And one movie on the positive side that you point to in this exhortation side is Apocalypto. And that's one thing I appreciate. And then another thing, I think, especially in this age where things have become so politicized, it seems to be an antidote to a lot of the poison of propaganda. And I think it's important for that purpose too, that we have these works of art that do transcend in that way, that can't be reduced into our little ideological boxes. I wonder if you might speak to that point, and how and why that's such a contrast to just mere propaganda, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, Apocalypto is that's a masterpiece, I think, of a movie. And I think it's a great example on many levels, because it's a great Hollywood chase movie. The whole movie's a chase movie, and that's pure Hollywood, right? But yet what it really is about is a much deeper philosophical worldview argument, but it's made without preaching. It's just made through the action and choices of the characters themselves. And it is addressing something that as you indicated, is a very common popular understanding now, in at least in the West, is this rejection of Western civilization and a attempt to, quote, return to the noble savage myth. This belief that without Western civilization and Christianity, these pagan cultures were, whatever, wonderful, ordered, beautiful cultures, and we messed them up, or whatever. We brought our evil and all this. That's the narrative, even like in America, right? The American Indian culture here was just, was just the noble savage myth and stuff. Well, this, of course, the story of Apocalypto takes place in the Mayan culture, where, it's the basic storyline is this member of a small tribe. His tribe is taken hostage by the Mayans, and he happens to have not been there. So when he comes back, this whole tribe is gone, and his pregnant wife is there too. So he goes chasing after to try to rescue them, and he brings them to the Mayan culture where they show in graphic detail the human sacrifice by the thousands, cutting out the heart, kicking the bodies down the pyramids, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's brutal, right? But it's important to have that because A, it really happened that way, but B, it is the only way to show the total depth of the lie of the noble savage. The very indigenous cultures of the Americas that are proclaimed as being beautiful and without us, they are the most evil of all without us, without Western civilization, without Christianity, you know? And so just by showing that and showing that reality just demolishes the narrative, the false narrative of the noble savage. And that's one of my favorite films because it does that, but it's completely entertaining in terms of, like I said, chase film and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's a good movie. I think that there's other examples that you know, we could go and like another example of that is this horror film called Midsommar. And that's a word for the midsummer feast or something. It's a pagan ritual. And I use these pagan examples because more and more now, I think movies are turning to pagan ideas, right? You have, well, like I said, I mentioned Avatar is back to pagan earth worship. And paganism is not just that it worships other gods, or it is an earth religion. So when you know, and so all the sci-fi movies now, all the movies about the earth, and it's always global or climate change, and we're killing the earth, and all this kind of lie, all these lies, and that comes from a return to a pagan mythology or a pagan worship of the earth, and so that's why it's so rooted in so many Hollywood movies. But I think sometimes you'll get a movie where it does the opposite, like Apocalypto or Midsommar, which is a horror film about this group of kids who travel to, I don't know, somewhere in the Netherlands. And it's supposed to be this little community that's just idyllic. They're agricultural. They worship the earth and all this kind of stuff. And it's just this fun experience to get away or whatever. And what it turns out to be is it's a pagan community that ends up sacrificing these visitors to their earth gods, right? And that shows you like, okay, it shows you this earth worship actually requires blood sacrifice. So let's not forget that what this return to earth worship that everyone is promoting leads to violence and ultimately human sacrifice. And I think that's a great story to tell. And I'm surprised sometimes that some of these movies are coming out of Hollywood because, you know, normally they're so, you know, Hollywood isn't a monolith. They're not all the same, but it's definitely a system, and a system is dominantly affected by certain views.
Mm-hmm.
But those are just a few examples of showing the great evil is the point of drawing you back to good. That's why God shows the massive evil of Sodom and Gomorrah. So when you see the judgment and the escape, you get the impact of it, right? When you see the book of Judges, which is so brutal, some of the wickedness, every man did what was right in his own eyes, and it shows you how wicked they become. Why? Because it shows you how badly they need God, and in particular, how badly they need a king to lead them to God. That's at least the purpose behind the book of Judges, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's biblical in that sense, if that makes sense.
No, that's excellent. And I think you answered a question that I had in my mind, but I don't have it clearly formulated, which was about the role of medium, because I could imagine some Christians would be okay in some ways with these things written down, but not on the screen, which we have in this unique medium of TV and film. And there, even if we do acknowledge an asymmetry there, it seems to me, to your point, that there are certain things that you can really bring home once you show them in this visceral manner. I don't know if you want to speak to that, and
Sure.
then a longer question, I suppose, is more to do. Well, we can do this separately, but then I wanted to get into redemptive kind of structure even of storytelling itself, which I think you illuminate. And you point to
Sure.
these different archetypal themes that make a good story, but then it can be done in more positive ways versus less positive ways. And you point out shows like The Truman Show is maybe more removed from the Christian story, and then you might have others mapped onto that redemptive pattern, but
Yeah.
aligned
Yeah.
more with our Christian story. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I do think it's a legitimate question for people to say, well, that's written in a book, so that's not the same as showing it all. And to some degree, that's partially true. But the reality is actually, if you think about this deeper, you realize actually the only difference between reading it and seeing it in a movie is the location of the image. When you're reading, the location of the image is in your mind, in your brain, but it's there.
Yeah.
When you read the book of Proverbs talking about the adulteress, her lips drip with honey. She calls him, you're going through the whole seduction scene with them, or Bathsheba, right? You're seeing the image in your brain, right? So you're seeing it, but it's in your brain. But when it's publicly, then it's a different location. Now, sure, there are different. I would agree that there are some. The mediums do require some differences of understanding, absolutely, and they affect differently, but they're not as different as people would like them to be. And so, for example, seeing people naked in a sexual context is biblically wrong and inappropriate. And it's not needed. Unfortunately, it's done too often in movies. I get that. But that's not the only porn, because there are, if you read some of these, romance novels, and it doesn't have to be 50 Shades of Grey, it could just be a lot tamer ones, but they're still creating these illicit romantic scenarios in women's minds. And that's just as much pornography, because it's still, the image is located in you, and it's still, what is the point of it all, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, like I've said, that doesn't mean you can't have adulterous relationships in movies, because to some degree, it's all about context. So to some degree, like the book of Proverbs, you have to paint the picture of seduction so that people can feel the draw of it. So that when you conclude the story, or when you conclude the image in Proverbs, the trap shuts and her legs reach down to hell. Her lips drip with honey, but her legs reach down to hell. And you can't feel the moral impact of that unless you're drawn a little bit into it. So that's the danger zone, but it's the same in literature as it is in a movie. And this is where I would argue that you can, draw them a little bit into the seduction of it in order to as long as you're making that moral point. Unfortunately, many movies don't make that moral point. Mm-hmm. One movie that I think does is I think it's called Unfaithful, with Richard Gere and Diane Lane, I think it was, and it deals with unfaithfulness with a wife and stuff, and a husband, and adultery, but it just shows grace and forgiveness that was just powerful, and overcoming that darkness rather than exploiting it and enjoying it, and promiscuity and adultery. And a lot of other movies will go, like Bridges of Madison County. These are all probably old movies, but maybe it dates me, but these are the ones that come to mind. Bridges of Madison County, the story of Clint Eastwood as the photographer, and Meryl Streep as this farm woman who's married to some husband, and the National Geographic photographer comes in town, and they have a whirlwind romance, and then he leaves, and she stays married, but she clings on to that whatever week of adultery in her heart to give her the happiness from her boring farmer husband, right? And she clings to it. She doesn't run off with the guy. She stays with her husband, right? That's supposed to be good, right? Well, the point of the story is, but she clings into her heart that the real love she experienced was with the adultery, right? And that's the negative side that Hollywood can do, where it tends to promote follow your heart. In fact, Disney movies have it literally in the words in almost every movie. Follow your heart, and in other words, don't let society and all these oppressive roles of husband and wife or whatever weigh you down, keep you from finding real love, which is the worship of the emotions of the self, right? So that's that's a corrupted, perverted version of love and romance and sexuality. But that doesn't mean that stories that are like, like unfaithful, or what was the classic one with Michael Douglas? What was it called? I can't remember it, on adultery. It was the Fatal Attraction, that was the classic, because it just showed the terror of what adultery can be, and how wicked it is in your life. But yeah, those might be some examples of of the location of the imagery, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I would argue that that particularly with something like sexuality and the body, that is a particularly visual phenomenon, although it can be in both cases. But that's a little harder to deal with than, say, language, because in language it can be in books and language can be in movies. It's the same thing. Again, what are you doing? Are you exploiting this just to have fun with the bad language, or are you showing it as part of that world that needs redemption? Both books and movies. The Bible has blasphemy in it, folks. When people say this, like, I draw the line on taking the Lord's name in vain and blasphemy. It's, well, guess what? There's a lot of blasphemy in the Bible, and the Lord's name is taken in vain. And so, and there's even some cuss words in there. And so, and I list some of those in my chapter 1 of Hollywood Worldviews, but all that to just say that there is not a lot of difference between the written word and the visual word.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, but people say, oh, but the Bible is what really happened. That's not fiction, right? So it really happened. So that's like news. It's like news reporting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of that, but not all of it. There's a lot of stories in there that aren't. There's parables. There are a lot of the prophecies are given as fictional stories with monsters, genetically mutated monsters killing people. And that's a fictional scenario that's intended to point to reality, but it's still fictional. And the parables are fictional, right? And so these, these stories that are written deal with the same material that's you're going to see on the screen. And so, yeah, be careful in how you approach it and how much but the big rule that I give there is context, context, context. That's what really determines the right or wrongness of most all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what a lot of people need to take into consideration when they're thinking through these things. So moving on to you're mentioning the structure, the story structure, and how it reflects redemption. Yeah, I talk a lot about that in Hollywood Worldviews, and I explain what the hero's journey is in terms of storytelling structure, and I do give some examples. I think I compare Truman Show with Braveheart, and Braveheart, this is where it's my favorite movie of all time, I think, and it has a perfect structure in many ways. And Braveheart does typify that redemptive structure that you should be looking for, And so, without take me a long time to talk about it, but a good hero's journey is going to have a hero who begins a story with an obsession or a passion about that he wants, but there's also something not quite right about the way that he sees the world. He's not entirely right. He's got something to learn, right? Or he's driven by something, an obsession that's not good, even if the object's good. So in Braveheart, there's an inciting incident. William Wallace is born and raised in Scotland, comes back to his village, finds a wife, and marries her in secret because the king or the nobles usually get to have sexual rights to them on the first night of marriage, which is horrible, right? But it was a reality. So he does it in secret. And anyway, they find out and they end up killing his wife. And they kill the love that was in William Wallace's life. The king himself, through his men, kill and destroy love. And that's what launches him on his journey of personal revenge in a way against the king. But ultimately, it is a journey for freedom. It's the King of Scotland, or King of England, who is oppressing the people of Scotland. And so William Wallace's obsession is to get rid of the king and kick him out of Scotland. And he does so by rising up, and men join him, and he fights against the king. But he's become a man of war, a man of of violence, because the king took away love, right? And we need to have, if that's a reality of human nature, right? When you destroy the love, you're going to get a man of war, and that's his weakness, right? So he fights, and there's battles, and he wins and sometimes loses, and it goes through the journey of obstacles until it gets to the point where he it looks like he's never going to achieve his goal, and that's a typical hero's journey. And that would be when he finally gets captured, and gets brought into the villain's lair. And that often happens near the last part of the movie. Hero gets captured and brought into the villain's lair, or experiences, faces death in some way. And it's when he's in jail facing his ultimate martyrdom that he finally realizes that what he sought to achieve, which was freedom by kicking the King of England out of Scotland, he's not going to achieve it with his violence. He's going to achieve it, if anything, through sacrifice. And in a very real sense, he has to die as a martyr, and he becomes the inspiration for Scotland to ultimately get rid of the king, right? But that's that Christ imagery of, okay, Christ wasn't going about with violence, but the point is he did become the sacrifice that takes the sins of the people upon himself. So William Wallace realizes he has to die in order to save England in a way. So he realizes he has to have a good death, and he has to stand firm, and he does. He gets tortured and gets killed, and he becomes, his resurrection, so to speak. Sometimes the hero comes back from the dead, or the hero just comes back after achieving the goal, and he brings with him the elixir of eternal life or something like that. And so for William Wallace, through his death, he becomes resurrected, so to speak, in Robert the Bruce, who carries on the torch and ends up fighting and freeing Scotland from England's tyranny. And so, those are sort of the components of the hero's journey, as they were expressed in the movie Braveheart.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. And another thing I wanted to ask you about, in line with what we discussed earlier, and in contrast in some ways to Apocalypto, and what we said about that was a wonderful antidote to modern kind of ideologies, and has that transcendent quality. You then, conversely, unfortunately, seem to have this modern kind of hermeneutic suspicion everywhere, and again, everything's politicized. So Dr. Peterson, Jordan Peterson, he will often lament this kind of postmodern neo-Marxism. And I'm reading this book by Christopher Rufo at the minute on America's Cultural Revolution, and I think that
great
there's
book.
definitely something to be said about the postmodern neo-Marxism. And in your work, you show this. So Rufo shows how these terms from the intellectuals, like you mentioned earlier, trickle down to the popular culture, and then you see it in universities and all these things. But I think also, unfortunately, you see it in films, and people are caught unawares in some ways. And I know, even in my experience, my wife and I started watching The Boys, and it's just
The what?
The Boys. The Boys.
Oh, yeah,
It's like that satirical, this crass postmodern kind of nihilistic show, and it seems to just want to tear down any institutions that are positive in American history or whatever. Just tear it down. Let's replace it with some new postmodern neo-Marxist shibboleth or whatever the case might be. And I want to ask about how we might wrestle with that as Christians, and I suppose, since so much of it is implicit, embedded in these stories, what advice you would give to Christians to wrestle with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think some people are already, some of it is, you can see for yourself. It's pretty evident, but you look for things like, so there are some positive images of Christianity that come out of Hollywood. I won't deny that, but it's mostly negative. And so basically what you do is you look for whatever characters are religious or specifically Christian. If they're in there and they're Christian, look and see how they're depicted. And they're almost always going to be, the negative, the the violent person or the secretly sexual addict, or whatever, or look for how they're linking the religious person to the evil, and then look and see, are there positive examples of of uh, of religion or of Christianity in that movie. And then that's what would make it not propagandistic. So if they're all negative, then you can okay, like The Handmaid's Tale, right? So it's like, oh, Christianity is the cause of all these bizarre things, from polyamory and whatever you call it, polygamy, to, oppression of women and stuff. It's all rooted in the Bible and Christians and all that kind of stuff. Not in Islam. That's interesting. But in Christianity, it's this delusionary worldview that doesn't even, like, there's not even remotely anything like that, or people promoting that at all. But that's the delusionary mindset where everything's negative, and and their caricatures, they say cliches, but here's my goal. Like, sometimes I don't mind watching movies that I disagree with the worldview, as long as if they're fair, and they sometimes will be, like some feminist movies or something, where mark of a feminist movie is all the men are cliches of some kind, and they're all negative cliches, abusers, womanizers, mindless idiots or whatever. But if there is an example of a positive example of a real Christian in there, then it's fair enough to say, okay, they're not saying all of Christianity is like this, because there is a good version of it, right? And that's how you tell a good story, by the way, is that you don't make all examples of someone negative, right? Like I said, you're going to be hard. It's going to be hard to find that sometimes, but I have in some movies. I can't. I'm trying to think of off the top of my head. I don't know if I can come up with them off the top of my head, but I've seen some where it's like, okay, it can have some negative faith people in there, but if they also have positive faith people, so I'm okay with that, because in truth, there are a lot of fake or bad religious people in this world, right? There are even some bad Christians, so I don't have any problem. I have that in my own stories. I have bad Christians, right? And even some of my movies I've written, I've had that. So, but the question is, do they also have some positive examples to counter that, so that they're not making them all the same? That's the bigotry, where they're all negative. And so look for the contrasting positive character. And if they're not there, then that's propaganda. And like I said, that's common in feminist movies, but I'm not always against it, because some of the negative men really are real. There are a lot of men like that, so I'm not entirely against it. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes I'm trying to find like some examples where I've had of that, where like I said, I wouldn't agree with them, but well, okay, let me see here. Oh, here we go. I'm looking for the feminist ones. I haven't seen the Barbie movie yet. I wish I could speak to that, but uh well, the classic is Thelma and Louise, but it's like, I kind of like the movie, because even though they're all negative stereotypes, there are men like that in the world. And that's the problem with the wokeness, is that you're only allowed to do stereotypes and cliches of white, male, heterosexual Christians and all that, but you can't do any stereotypes of any other type of people, because that's hate and bigotry, right? And of course, that is itself hatred and bigotry. But the truth is that all characters have some reflection of an archetype. Is it a stereotype, or is it an archetype? And an archetype is simply, well, the reason why there are stereotypes is because there are a lot of people like that. And so there's nothing wrong with having those characters. The question is, do you bring complexity? Is there complexity to character? Is a character all bad? And if they are, then that's a poor character. But if you can show, like, this is why sometimes a good movie will show a villain who, like, loves children or something, so like, he's this bad guy who's killing all these people, but he won't let children get hurt, and he'll kill his own man if the man hurts a child. That's an example where they're trying to say, look, even the most wicked of people still has a reflection of God's image in them, and that's a good villain. And by the same token, if you're looking at these characters and stereotypes in movies, look for that. If they don't have any counterbalancing traits, then they're just cliches and stereotypes. They're not real. They don't give a sense of real humanity. So I'll write a story and I'll have atheists or Christians in it, and I show the sins of the Christians and I show the good things of the atheists, because reality is much bigger than me, much bigger than us, and I want to be fair in portraying the best of these versions of people in the world, so that when I give my redemption or when I give my answers to them, I'm, they call it straw manning, is when you show the worst example of a character or a stereotype, right? So I want to steel man. I want to show a character who might represent an atheist viewpoint, but do the best version of them, because that's what more people are going to identify. They're not going to identify with my spin, but then through the story is how I convince them and persuade them that, oh, this view is not a legitimate view.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you, Brian. And I don't want to keep you all day, so I'm going to move towards the end of my questions, because I want to, about this book in particular, because I want to ask you about your other work. So I suppose if I might ask you, actually, what encouragement then, you have all these wonderful points that I'm not going to get to about archetypes of Christ figures, good versions and lesser versions and so on, which I think is great. And there's bits about Nietzsche and everything. I'd encourage people to get the book, obviously. But I want to ask about the encouragement that you would give to Christian creators today who want to go beyond being consumers. I think in part because it seems like a time of opportunity. And my friend Jonathan Pajot, who I did an event with in Ireland, he's doing really well. He's set up his own publishing company and everything. And he says it's in part because woke filmmakers are tossing aside some of these great stories. So he saw that Hollywood or Disney were going to come out with Snow White, and they knew that they couldn't tell that story in its traditional form. So he's like, let me take this opportunity and I will write the story. He's got this comic book and everything. I wonder if you'd speak to that and the opportunities for Christian creators today then.
Yeah. Well, sadly, sadly, Hollywood is dead because of the wokeness. Now, that doesn't mean, I've been thinking about this. So Hollywood's dead, but there are still, on its rotting corpse, there are still some budding plants that are growing out of it, and so there are still some good movies and series that have gotten made. In fact, I got to say, with all the wokeness in all these stories, which is ruining it, I just want to highly recommend a couple of movies that are out now or coming out now. One is American Fiction, which is about a Black author who realizes he has to write ghetto stories in order to sell. And it deals with all that stuff about what's going on with the mentality of DEI in our culture and such, but it's complex. I would argue that it shows both sides of the argument in a very good way. I would argue it's anti-woke ultimately, but it does have some woke components in it. But that's what good art is. I don't mind having a fairness of both views so that you can wrestle with it together. Because a movie doesn't have to give answers. It can, but it doesn't have to. And sometimes just inspiring the thinking, And the other one is another anti-woke movie called Dream Scenario with Nick Cage. And he plays a professor who magically starts to, for some unknown reason, he starts to appear in people's dreams, everybody's dreams all around him, and then soon in the country. And it's this absurdist comedy, but it really brings up this notion of the subjective definition of the self that is ruining people's lives, and you project your own bigotry upon other people, which is what wokeness is. And so those are two movies that I'm amazed that they came out of the Hollywood structure, right? But in terms of, sadly, the wokeness has happened such that a lot of us have been pushed out because, quite frankly, like I used to, I've always been an independent filmmaker. So basically what that means is you find independent producers and directors. They're not making the big studio films, but they're trying to get their own films made because, you can't get studios to make these films, and you got to raise your money and get your movie. And we try to fly in under the radar and make a great movie that also happens to have our viewpoint in it, but hopefully it'll be so good that it'll get picked up and distributed in the end because it's good. And that's kind of been the independent paradigm for forever. But in recent years, because of the wokeness, because the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion worldview, that is just, it's not diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
It is, you know, inequity. It's unequal, and it's, you know, it's just not what it claims to be. It's the opposite, in other words, of everything it is. It's racist and all this. So the imposition of these values has meant that they become bolder in literally just saying, you know, attacking, you know, cutting out any conservative viewpoints or any Christian viewpoints. They just will fire you, and they'll just, you know, and then they'll demand that you change your story to include these racist paradigms of DEI. And so a lot of us have been pushed out now, and they're hunting us down and not and kicking us out and not letting us work. It used to be where, you know, you kind of fly under the radar, like I said, and now, no, they're hunting us down. And so the parallel economy has grown. It's not the ideal. It's not what I wanted, but the truth is Daily Wire's got their own movie company now, and they're making some great stuff. And of course, there's the Christian world has always been its own sort of field, but a lot more people are working outside the system now because we have to, not, you know, and it's a harder world, you know, to get by, but you just have to find who the people are, and you know, be willing to suffer for a while to grow together. You know, yeah. So one of those components for me has been novels. So I had a few years in the past that were not doing well for screenwriting. I wasn't making a lot of money. I had to expand my horizons, right? So I thought, well, you know what? Maybe now's the time to try doing novels. It's not like I wanted to be the great American novelist, but I thought, you know, hey, it's something I could always do. And self-publishing was just starting. It was becoming really big. And it's like, well, that's interesting. But I wrote my first novel, which was based on a screenplay called Noah Primeval. It's the story of Noah in the Bible. And I tried to get you know, it's about the Bible, but it's got supernatural elements, Nephilim giants and wild supernatural stuff. And, you know, I push the envelope, I have a little fun with it, but I try to make it all biblical and theologically consistent with the Bible. But I couldn't get an agent, and I couldn't get Christian publishers. It was just too aggressive for them. Maybe too much sex and violence. I don't know. Not woke enough, maybe. I don't really know. I couldn't get any interest in it. So I published it myself. That's the parallel economy. But now the world is set up where it's more doable. In the past, you're on your own. You can't get anybody, you know, but now you've got Amazon, you've got all these books in distribution, and then you've got advertising on Facebook. You can do it all yourself and actually sell books. So I started that like 13 years ago, and lo and behold, it blew up. It just, and then I started writing. I've got like now 15 novels in the several series all interwoven together. The first series called Chronicles of the Nephilim. And like I said, it's stories from the Bible that are about these giants or about watchers, these supernatural watchers over the nations that you see in Daniel 10 and such and elsewhere in the Bible. I explain all that, but I also retell these stories with that paradigm that's in the Bible, but a lot of modern Westerners didn't see it. And so, yeah, like I said, now I'm up to like 15 books in 3 series, and they're all integrated, and they're just exploding. Christians are loving this. I thought that Christians would react and saying, "You're playing with the word of God. This is blasphemy." Because I'm kind of like writing like Lord of the Rings and type of stuff, you know. And there are some people who do. Obviously, there are some Christians who think that and say that to me. But by and large, no. I mean, the sales are going through the roof. And people are loving these things because Christians do have a better imagination than this bigoted stereotype of Christians is all being like these fundamentalists who like don't like creativity and don't like art and all this stuff. It's not true. There are a lot of Christians who get it. They understand the difference between the imagination and between truth and facts, and that and the need to keep those things understandable and separate, but also the ability to integrate them in a way that the Bible even does, right? You know, like I said, with the parables or with other storytelling components. And they get it. And I've been surprised, but, you know, grateful to God that he has opened up this parallel economy where I am self-published, but I am doing better than many published authors are doing, and selling more books and getting a wider audience. So it is possible, is my only point. Now, in the world of film, it's a group venture, right? So it's going to be a lot harder, but you have to find those communities. You have to uh, just do your own work of track down those producers who are involved with places like the Daily Wire or whatever, and try to get your foot in the door. Find out how you can try to work with them, and then you get plugged into that system. But they're out there now, and I'm thankful for that. It's gonna be a harder road because Hollywood wasn't built in a day, and movies are millions of dollars, right? And the better movies, you need a lot more money, right? And so it's a lot harder to raise $15 million to make a good movie, and how to make that money back. It's an almost impossible task. So you have to be ready to really, if that's your goal, if that's your interest. But if your interest is storytelling, um, you know, self-publishing is the way to go now. It's just and by the way, publishers are also woke. Like they won't, like publishers aren't interested in me. I'm a white middle-aged male. They literally would say, we don't want you. You're white. So we're only looking for marginalized minorities and people of color and inclusive voices, which means we're only interested in gay, trans worldviews. We don't want Christian Western civilization worldviews. So in a way, it's most of our institutions have been captured by woke. So we're all on our own now, and you have to find a way to be able to do your art or do your creativity outside of that system, sadly, until it collapses. Because I do believe, I don't know. There's to a certain degree, society is manipulated and can be, can regress, because obviously it does, right? Our society has murdered 60 million babies, right? So it's like, and we're still murdering babies. So it's not like we're always progressing. But what was I getting to? Wokeness does destroy storytelling because it becomes a religion where you have to preach propaganda and you have to preach specific narratives, and it's an artificial inclusion, which means it's actually like it's racism in the name of anti-racism. It is exclusion in the name of inclusion, and that can't hold up. You can't treat people with bigotry and racism and hate and not let it ultimately affect your product and bring it down. As the famous phrase is, go woke, go broke. Well, that's not always true. The movie Barbie is very woke and it made a gazillion, but I think there's a good reason for that. That's not having to do with the wokeness, but nevertheless, there's also, I think in the long run, this stuff becomes less satisfying. Like if you watch a lot of these, like a lot of Netflix new movies, I'm not watching a lot of them because they're not interesting. They're diversity hires. They're not as good of actors. The stories are just, they don't ring true because of this wokeness. So I'm finding myself watching more foreign stuff like Korean and French and German and even some British and stuff. But it's like Korean filmmaking is like where Hollywood was 20 years ago, but it's got good quality production values and it's following the Hollywood storytelling paradigm of the past. So in many ways, I think like the Korean filmmaking is better, more interesting to me in that sense. So yeah, these are the things that are swirling around my interpretation of them. And I do believe that wokeness, it's like any propaganda. Ultimately, it can do some damage and it can grab hold of some of society, but it ultimately is not going to satisfy because it isn't true and it doesn't ring true with people in their souls. So they're just not going to watch as much. And that's why, and you see a lot of people watching fewer movies because of that. But then you get some traditional movie comes in with traditional masculinity like Top Gun, and it's blows away, makes gazillion dollars because people still like masculine males who are heroes. Yeah, hello. That's actually part of human nature, and it's a good thing. And so, fine. If you're going to give us one movie with a good, well, I'll go watch that one movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I do think in the long run that I don't think it's sustainable, but in the short term, it can be because it's forced. It's being forced by all the people in power, and they have all the money, and they're just willing to lose money and stuff, and hoping that eventually they'll convert people into thinking their ways. but I don't think you can. So in the long run, so they'll get some people, but not a lot of people. So
No, that's great, Brian, and that there is always cause for hope. Obviously, it being a
yeah.
theological virtue, and we can make that distinction between hope and optimism. And then, is there anything else that you're working on that you'd like to tell my viewers or listeners about? Or I suppose, based on what you said, in a dream scenario, if you could build that team around you and the money was there, what you'd like to do? I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think in those terms, but
Yeah.
my latest project that I just released a few months ago was called, it's another new novel, completely different from my Bible novels. And it's a, I call it a theological thriller. It's like Silence of the Lambs, serial killer story, but and I like to write about um the human nature, the problem of evil, the existence of God. These are all things that are story concepts that can be embedded within thrillers, you know. So it's different from all my Bible novels, and it's called Cruel Logic, the Philosopher Killer. And the basic premise of the novel is there's a brilliant serial killer on a college campus, and it's a woke college campus, and he's capturing university professors and he debates them. And the topic of the debate is his moral right to kill them. So he'll get some professor in the chair, like an evolutionary biologist or a queer theorist or what have you. And he'll say, okay, if what you say is true about reality, give me one logically valid reason why I should not kill you, and I'll let you go. And of course, they have a hard time doing it because all of man's philosophies reduce, or shall we say, do not provide any foundation whatsoever for a moral right and wrong in the universe. And this man is a philosopher himself, this serial killer. And so, yeah, he's making a philosophical point, but there's much more to it than that. And there's a whole, storyline about the wokeness of the university. And I've got a Jordan Peterson character in the story. One of my heroes is, his name is Joseph Callinger, and he's a psychiatrist who is helping the cop track down the killer. And he's like Jordan Peterson, he's into he's supporting Western civilization and mythology and Jungianism. And he has his own journey of wrestling, spiritual wrestling in his own life. And so I'm trying to deal with a lot of this woke reality that we have in the world today and make some sense of it in the context of how does Christianity answer this? And so that's available. All my books are available exclusively at Amazon.com in Kindle, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook. Almost all of them are available in all, and large print now too. I have large print. And so that's where you get it all exclusively. If you want to check that out, but also I have a website, Godawa.com, my name, GODAWA.com. I have a lot of interesting things on there, freebies and articles related to the things that I write and stuff. And I even cast my novels with pictures of the cast if people are interested in that. So that's where you can find out more information on me if you want.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Brian. And I would recommend, amongst other things, your article on the Matrix, which is on your website. I sent that to my friend and he loved it. So I think he's going to read your book now. And that might be a little
Cool.
place to spring into your work. And thank you so much for your time today, Brian. I appreciate it. And God bless you and your ministry. And I look forward to reading some more of those books too.
Thanks for having me on, Marcus.
I'm going there. No